Hello, Kristin. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Astra. I'm so excited to be here today. I just love you so much, and you're so smart and you ask such great questions. And I am interested to see how our path of
Yeah.
conversation winds through this time.
Oh yeah, me too. Even when we had our first conversation, you have such a unique story in so many ways. Even even the fact that this is like a weird thing to start with, but one thing that I noticed was when I went through some of your social posts that people would like be commenting on your like hair color or
Oh, yeah.
glasses, stuff like that.
Yes.
And that's something that I have seen in general. A lot of times when we are behind the screen, our voices can get louder. We are more freely. This like I don't even think that it's our true opinion. A lot of times we just want to kind of say something. But then on the other side of it, there's always one person who's receiving it. And how and I also know that you said that you have like social anxiety and something like that. And that's a big thing even to show up online, when you have that.
Right.
So how do you deal with people who are kind of commenting on things that, well, first, I don't think they really have place to comment on, but at the same time, you're still out there. You have to deal with that.
Yeah, I would say that my 20s were okay. My teens were like a living hell. And in my like mid 30s, I kind of settled into myself really purposefully. And I started asking myself questions like, if I was to do what I wanted and not think about anyone else or their opinions, what kind of clothes would I wear? How would I do my hair? What color would it be? Because I've always wanted, actually, my hair's blue right now.
Yeah.
I go between blue, pink, purple, like teal, gray. I just do what I want. But first, like as a teenager, I always wanted blue hair. And my parents were like, no, that's crazy. And I was in the punk rock scene as well. So I did the best I could with what I had. I dyed my hair neon orange, right? I really wanted blue, but so when I started my own business, no one was in control of me anymore as far as how I looked, how I dressed. So I was like, I'm just going to lean into the way of dressing and acting and showing up that makes me feel most like myself. And that's going to intimidate people. That's going to irritate people because when they see me, I'm confronting them visually, right? I'm wearing bright colors. I have different hair. My glasses are they've been called outrageous in a positive way, and I loved that.
Yeah. They're amazing.
Thank you. I'm wearing my favorite pair today. And people always ask me, like, where did you get your glasses? And there's actually, she calls herself the geriatric fashionista. Her name's Iris Apfel. And she made wearing big glasses a thing because she liked it. And almost every frame I have is designed by her.
Wow. How did you, even the question that you asked yourself that helped you to maybe make that transition, how did you come up with it? Because that can be really transformative question to answer, especially if you end up acting on it as well.
Yeah, I think I was just, I did a lot of things in my life where not just the way I looked was controlled, but the way I behaved all the time was like under scrutiny. When I worked with different organizations, and I was just tired of having to look at myself through someone else's lens. And I decided I'm going to go on a purposeful journey. And my husband, Travis, was really encouraging. When I bought my first pair of like big glasses, they were really mild actually compared to these, but he was like, okay, I can see what you're starting to do. And I just started getting rid of all my clothes and buying really colorful clothes. And he's like, I love it when you're like this because you are yourself. And he's like, you never look more beautiful than when you're yourself. And I was like, okay, this is working because I feel beautiful too. I feel, and it's helped me actually with my social anxiety because instead of hiding behind a shield to show up, I just show up as myself. And I'm open to people receiving me how they want. And I know that it's really a them issue because I'm always going to show up with kindness and empathy and just wanting you to succeed, right? That's why I love what I do professionally. So if you have a problem with that, it's not because I was rude to you. It's not because I was mean. It's because maybe you're struggling with some self-worth problems. You maybe are not able to fully step into who you are at this moment. And I would just say, like, I hold space for that because I needed that space as I was on my own journey. So when people comment, there's two ways I deal with the rude comments, right?
Yeah.
Like well, and people call me fat too all the time because I'm
Oh,
plus
okay.
size and I'm unashamed about it. My husband always laughs. He's like, you could probably do more Supermans than any of these old white guys who are teasing you online, which is true. I'm sure I can because I do exercise. It's important to me. And I'm as active as I can be with my physical limitations, but I don't apologize for being overweight, and that makes people so uncomfortable. So I think I have to make space for where they are on their journey. And if they're online making fun of, I'm a woman, I'm a mom, all these things I am as a person, if they're coming after me, then I want to feel empathy for them. I'm not really like into sympathy. I want to feel with you, not for you. So I try to engage that part of my mind to think, what did I feel like when I couldn't be myself? And I try to give grace to them. And I also have a social media manager who goes through and deletes things for me so I don't see them. Like they're if you're, and I'm sure you know this because you're online, if you put your face out there, like you said on the screen, there are going to be people who respond, and I will get responses that are like aggressive sexual things, and I block those. But I don't need that in my head all the time. So that's when my assistant will come in and she just will get rid of those things for me. So I don't have to make space for those because it's not necessary. They're not coming from a place of hurt. They're coming from a place of aggression, and I don't need that.
Yeah, and in a way, I liked how Grant Cardone was talking about it because he said like he has like a lot of haters, obviously. Like
Yeah,
I think like most people that get big on social media, there's no chance you will not get haters. It's just part of the game. It's the
it is.
same, even like when you were talking about being truly you. That's one thing that I learned is that when you're now being in a position where you try to please everybody or try to adjust to everybody, you're not really being yourself and you end up feeling miserable. So when you are being you and somebody doesn't like it, in a way, it's like a assurance that you're moving away from being people pleaser or just pleasing everybody or like, oh, I have to be like this with this person or with this person, which sometimes it's useful to adapt to situations. But if that now gets in a way of you being you, that's kind of toxic. But and the way Grant Cardone was talking about it is that actually haters are a good thing because they might actually be talking about you more than
Right.
people that are your fans. So you actually get more exposure from having
Yes.
haters. And one interesting thing that I heard, even when it comes to personal branding, that when you are unique online, people remember you. So even though they might not like you, or I'm not saying everybody doesn't like you, like I'm just focusing on those people.
Right.
But they still remember you.
That's
They still
true.
know who you are. So it's
Yeah.
like you don't know them, you don't know who they are, but I know who you are. So
Right.
it's a really interesting dynamic how even like social media works, and how it and most of the people that are commenting, they wouldn't be putting themselves out there as well most of the time.
That's
Um,
true.
they don't know what it actually takes to put yourself out there and be consistent with it and deal with all that negativity that comes with that as well.
Right. And also, yeah, so like I was talking to one of my friends and his messaging is polarizing. Like he says the most outlandish things. If you're listening to this, Sajad, I'm not going to apologize because you would hate that anyway. So we're partnering to do a networking group because our viewpoints are different. It's called the most polarizing networking group on earth. And he has so much hate that we think that one of his haters hacked our website this week and like brought it down. It was so dramatic. It's never happened to me like that before. But because he's so polarizing, people are curious about him. And even if they won't interact with him directly, they're talking about him. Like he's had people say, oh, we talked about you in our networking group for 40 minutes today. And he's like, great, free advertising, it doesn't
Yeah.
upset him. So I think if you are going to step into that persona and you can do it and it works for you, congratulations. Like, I have no problem with that at all, because there's that saying, there's no such thing as bad press.
Yeah.
As a marketing expert, I see that every day. And also, like, people will talk about me now, and I have no idea how they know about me, but like, my friends will be like, they're talking about you today. They were saying, oh, I need to have my branding stand out more like that glasses lady who's really colorful, because everyone remembers her. And I was like, okay, yes, I'm doing it right.
Yeah. And that's the unique thing about you, that people remember. I love the glasses lady with the colorful hair.
I was like, yeah,
That's
that
brilliant.
sounds right. So I've just embraced it. Like, when people call me, they're like, oh, are you the glasses lady? I'm like, yeah, that's me. Like, they're like, oh yeah, you like storytelling, right? I'm like, I would love to hear your story.
Yeah. And now they literally associate big glasses with you and with storytelling. So now they have built this persona in their mind that they know that when somebody needs that, or they need that themselves, they can go to you. So in a way, you're making your marketing work without, like, just with, in a way, being yourself. And that's
Right.
something that maybe you can also talk on this more, because many times people, I feel like they have this sense that they have to be specific person when they're online, or they can't really be themselves, or they're not allowed to be themselves, or especially I think one of the reasons might be because that's personal. If somebody says something, they might say that to that persona, but I don't necessarily say that to you, who you really are, because it didn't really show who you are.
Yeah.
But that's something that I have seen that many people struggle with, to actually show up as themselves, or they're afraid to show up as themselves. Maybe you can share your experience, or some people that you know that have gone through that, which probably is most people, I think.
Yeah, I think this is a piece I do work on with all of my clients, because by the time they find me, usually they're exhausted and they've been through what I call mean client syndrome, where they've showed up as this person they think they're supposed to be. They attract the person to work with them who likes that persona, and then working with them is exhausting and frustrating, because they're pretending the whole time, and also they don't like that type of personality the other person has. So they end up in this like cycle of exhaustion. They feel like, I hate what I do. And I'm like, no, you're good at what you do, but you're showing up in a way to attract people you don't like working with, or as I call them, meanies, right? Because these are the people that will make my clients cry. Like, I'll be talking to them and they're just crying. And I'm like, this is a persona problem, because you're not showing up as yourself. When you show up as yourself, and I'm not passionate about this at all, when you show up as yourself, you attract the kind of people who like working with someone who has your personality. So you don't have to pretend the whole time. And usually you'll get along better with them, because they know who you are. They're going to work with that. And that's why they chose you. And that feels good. That feels validating. So it's a totally different experience. It's the kind where you're like, oh, that was my client. Now it's my best friend.
Yeah. And even that when you attract somebody that you see you don't want to work with, you can always say no. And I think that's another thing that might be a struggle, that, oh, but I found this like client, they're like really like a good opportunity to work with them, but if you feel that they are not really a good client, it doesn't really matter how much they pay, because you will pay with your mental health.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, do you know who Kate Donovan is?
No.
Write her name down. Cait Donovan,
Okay.
Donovan. She has this podcast called Fried, the Burnout Podcast. And she's my friend. Let me just preface by saying that I love her so much. But her whole preface is that resentment is your superpower, because when you get the money from that person who you did not like working with, does it feel good, or do you feel resentful? And you feel resentment. And she's like, when you feel resentment, it's time to assess what you're doing, because you need to adjust, either raise your prices. But I do have a story. I was like really excited to work with this one person who had this, IP they had invented to filter out unsafe sounds for your brain. from everything, literally anything. And I was like, this is exciting. And no one else has
Wait,
done this.
unsafe sounds in what way?
Like there are certain frequencies of sounds that kind of block your brain from learning at its maximum. And they fatigue you over time, which is why, like, when you're on an airplane, if you wear noise canceling headphones, you feel better because you don't have that frequency going the whole time, because the whole time the frequency is going, your brain is working to process it. So he invented this software that could filter out these different harmful frequencies so that anything you listen to would only be positive stimulating frequencies. But he developed it in a way that he didn't lose the audio quality, because every other thing I've listened to, the audio quality is junk after it's gone through the filter. And so I was like thrilled. I found out he didn't have a copywriter. I got on a call with him. We had a blast. We had the most fun. And then he completely ghosted me. And I was like, okay, I don't know what happened. I was like nervous. I was like wanting to throw up before our meeting because I was so excited. And then he ghosted me and I was like, all right, I'm not going to chase him, you know? And I saw him again in a networking group. And he said this one sentence to me. It's rare that there's another ghostwriter in the group, because I'm a ghostwriter and a copywriter. And I was talking to another gentleman who was a ghostwriter, and we were just having fun together. But this person, the inventor, was in the group with us, and he's like, I know him. He just said this like randomly. He's like, I know him. I trust him. I'm not sure I can trust you. And I was like, that's
about
it.
you?
About me. I was like, I'm never working with him. No matter how much he pays me, no matter how cool his invention is, because I gave him an hour of my time. I sent him, he could have gotten to know me easily, right? Like you said, you were listening to different things that I created earlier today. If you want to know me, I have so much content out there, and I'm just completely myself 100% of the time. So if you want to get to know me, it's easy. I make it super simple.
I was about to say that you show up really, like, I could say that you show up as yourself. You're not really like playing like a persona or something like that.
Yeah. So I knew, I was like, if he wanted to get to know me, he would have. And it sounds like working with him would be a nightmare, because if the burden is on me to prove my value, to prove my expertise, and to prove that I'm someone who's trustworthy, I'm going to be doing that over and over again the whole time with him. And I know, because I've done it before with clients and I just hated it.
Trust is a really tricky thing, I think, because we can't really force it. It's not like you now can do something specific to make that person trust, because even if they told you, and that's something that I hear a lot when it comes to business or just relationships, trust is huge. But even if they said, okay, I need you to do this to prove me that I can trust you, even then, no, they can kind of sense that, oh, now you're trying to do something to get my trust, you know? And trust is something that, I don't know, it's most of the time, of course, depending on like the level of relationship, or let's say how big the project is, something like that, it might take time to build up. But at the same time, it's really hard to, even for you as providing a service, it's really hard to take a client who doesn't trust you, because how that will affect your like working relationship. Because like, how can you serve somebody who doesn't trust you? Because then there will be all this like micromanaging, or they just keep checking everything, stuff like that, or they just keep coming at you, asking for questions, when is it going to be ready, stuff like that. Because when somebody doesn't trust you, and that's something that I have seen some of my clients that I work, when it comes to some of their bosses or like in leadership, that or even when they are leaders themselves, that they have this challenge, especially initially. You might actually talk on this more, that when you start your business as solopreneur and then you start to hire people initially, because you want to have this, and you also mentioned you're a perfectionist, which is huge. So if you're a perfectionist as well, and you have this high standard for the service that you offer, now you have somebody come in, you will naturally start to micromanage them, because they're like, oh, and like it has to be perfect. But at the same time, what that person senses is that you don't trust me. You don't trust me and my abilities to do the work or do it the level that you would want to do. So trust is a huge, but like maybe you can talk about your experience with like perfectionism or micromanaging or something like that. Did you have that experience as well?
So I will say that, like, in general, what I'm I'm a perfectionist when it comes to my own work,
Oh, okay.
but my standards are insanely high because, right, my branding has to be tight. So like, even with my social media manager, sometimes I'm like, the text isn't tight enough. Like, you need to go through it again. And she's so good, and she will. And because she knows I'm not saying you're doing a bad job, I'm saying for my branding, this has to be perfect
Yeah.
because
She probably just
language.
knows you as well.
And she does, yes. And that's something else, is like, in general, I try to work with people I already have relationships with. It could be a new relationship, but when I'm working with someone, it has to be someone that I like being around, because I know we will be spending time together. But I also, anyone I work with, or anyone who works for me, I should say, because, right, that's my job as I'm scaling, is I'm hiring people and training them, which is so bizarre. But I want them to win. So I don't set them up to work in my business. I set them up with their own business, and I contract them, and I tell them, take as many clients as you want, but I'm a legacy client. So I'll be glad to get on your waiting list, but I get first slot. If you're okay with that, I'll help you do all this. And they're like, okay, it's fair, right? I'm empowering them to go out and grow, and I have quality work. And a lot of people aren't willing to trust someone that much. And I think that's the problem. Especially like for me, I'm a copywriter. I'm working with know, like, trust every minute of every day. And I'm building that for my clients, and I'm building that for myself. So if at the end of the day, you've encountered 3 pieces of my work, whether it's an article, a video, and let's say something short form, I've built know, like, and trust into every piece of content I create. And if you still don't trust me at the end of that, there are 2 possible reasons. The first reason is you don't trust yourself to make the decision, which is okay. Like, and it's okay to acknowledge that, like, I'm working on trusting myself. It's okay to say that sentence and to be actively working through it. But the other one is I'm not ready to work at that level. Right? Because we're all on a journey, and sometimes people will come to me and they're like, I just can't afford you yet. And I'm like, that's fine. Email me any questions you have. And actually, I'm building a system so they can afford to work with me. If they just do what I say, they'll be able to afford to work with me. And I'm going to give that out for free. But I want to support them on their journey where they are. And I would much rather have someone tell me, hey, I can't afford to work with you right now. I like, this is what I hear a lot. I like your vibe. So apparently I give off a vibe that some people like. I like your vibe. I want to talk to you again in 6 months. And I'm like, yes, fine, good. I love that. And I tell them my prices. I'm unashamed of my prices because they are vital for me. There's like a gate, right? But my price is the gate between me and the quality of client that I need right now in my career. That doesn't mean I won't help you if you can't afford me. And that doesn't mean I will even recommend, because some of my friends charge less than I do because they haven't been doing it as long. And I will send people their way because I know they'll get good results. I don't look at it as competition, but I know that eventually the people who are meant to work with me will work with me. And I trust them to know that. And I trust myself to stay open to that and not, I don't take it personally when someone doesn't hire me. And I think that's an acquired skill. You have to learn how to do that. And also I tell people no, like you said, there's so much safety in no for everyone involved. If I tell you no, you're not, and I did. So this week, someone wanted to talk to me about a ghostwriting thing. That's like, for me, that's a $50K offer for the ghostwriting and the messaging. And I was like, I would love to work with you, but you're not ready yet. You need to go do the introspective work and figure out how you want to move forward. Here's some tools I have to do that. I'm here for you. And when you have that moment, when you feel like you're nervous to talk to me again, that's when we should meet. So book a meeting and we'll talk about it. And I'm here to support you. And she's like, well, how do I pay you right now? And I'm like, you don't. And that's okay. you're going to pay me when you're ready to work on this thing that I do. But for now, I'm here in a support role. And it doesn't take that much of my time, right? To hop on a call with someone for 30 minutes. I just point them in the direction that, like, here are two paths you could take for the next leg of your journey. And when you get to that place where you're like, I'm ready, let's scale up, let's get the consistency and the visibility to get me, my first 10K month, my first 50K month, like, that's when I'm here and I will do the work with you. But until then, I'm just supporting you.
And that's also how you build trust with them, where they actually end up coming to you instead of somebody else when they need that service.
Right. And, the goal for me, and I think this is one of the things we have in common, the goal for us is not to get rich, right? Like, we know we can make money. We've been through that part of our journey where we're like, okay, I can actually charge for things and people will pay. But we're interested in building relationships and making the world a better place. And I always say, I want to make the world a better place one story at a time. But if you're just working for money, you would never be willing to support someone in that way and take the time to earn their trust.
Oh yeah, for sure. And even the fact that that's something that I see in so many people, the understanding of the money, that's ultimate goal, but actually money is just a byproduct of how much value you add. So the more valuable you become, the more valuable asset you become to somebody else or their business or whatever it is that you offer, the more you get paid. It's that simple. Money is just showing how effective you are at giving results. Of course, there are many people who are out there who are being coaches and coaching thousands or whatever for just like building their coaching business, don't like coaching coaches.
That's not good.
That's a different story.
Yeah.
But I'm talking more about like how it, in my eyes, should be, where the more valuable you become, the more you can charge. Like you said, that you probably are like most likely are ahead of some people that who are doing what you're doing that may be charging less. But that's why you charge more, because you're ahead, like you're years ahead. It doesn't mean that they will not get there. As long as they keep going, they'll get to that level. It's just the path of like that journey. The further you go, the better you become, the more you get paid. It's in a way, it's that simple. But also what you said about, in a way, like when people don't want to work with you, so I would even add another reason that sometimes, like, usually I say, like jokingly, it's just that maybe they just don't like my face or my accent. There's like, there can be such a small thing that has nothing to do with what I do or what I offer that they just don't like. And that's fine. And that exactly what you said is that I'm not for everybody, and that's fine. I don't aim to be for everybody. I understand that my approach might be different or not the best for somebody else, but if that's not the right approach, I know another person who might be better offer or better like person for you to work with. And that's something that I have seen also. And even like I had a period in my life where I was also like, oh, I don't really want to talk to like other coaches or my competitors and stuff like that. And then I realized that I actually do a disservice to people that I talk to that are my potential clients that might not be my clients, where I don't have anybody else that I can guide them to or send them to. Instead, because now I'm like, oh, I can't help you with that. But instead, I can actually give you a few more people that you can go to, or even like, I can, like, whenever they ask something, that's not something that I specifically help with. Oh, I can help you with that.
Right. I know that's what you do at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
You're like, I can do whatever you need. Yeah.
And then over time you learn that, what, actually I will not be serving you well if I tell you that I can help you with this. I actually know somebody who is specializing in this, so you better go to them. And it actually takes a bit of ego work, I think, because now you're potentially like losing money by sending them to somebody else, but at the same time you gain trust because they see that it's not your main goal isn't to kind of cash out and get money from them.
Right. Sell them something, anything. Right.
Yeah. Which you actually want to help.
It won't help. And that's where I'm at now, where I stopped offering, because people would be like, hey, can you redo all my web copy? And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. but I'm not going to anymore unless you hire me to do everything, because if it doesn't match, the client gets confused, and confused prospects do not buy. Confused people do not purchase. And so I realized by offering them this thing, which normally people who hire me to do their web copy do hire me to do other things. But if they don't, their messaging looks like a wreck, and it's a disservice to them. Right. So now I have that qualifier. I'm like, if we're going to do this work, if we're going to do the research, let's make everything match so that your business is consistent, right? It's that base of consistency, because no matter how much visibility you have, if you don't have the consistency first, and you don't have ways for them to purchase and go through know, like, and trust and awake, aware, action, they cannot spend their money with you, and they will not.
Yeah. So speaking of trust, we know what are the things that might affect having no trust or very little trust. But what did you say? How do you build trust?
So for me, and this is my specialty, and this is why I can charge more, honestly. Also, if you get a specialty in your field, and my mentor was really encouraging me about this yesterday, because I'm struggling in this new stage of growth I'm in, and I've added a third specialty, which is offer creation. But if you have a specialty, you offer 2 or 3 things at once, which is going to accelerate whatever you're doing. It makes it go faster. And anytime you can bring speed, you can charge more, because people will pay more for speed. So one of my specialties is storytelling, because, and we've geeked out about the brain science a little bit in our last conversation. But if you really want to establish trust, you have to show yourself as a fellow human being in a relatable experience with the same emotional patterns. It doesn't have to be the same circumstances, but the same emotional patterns, so that your prospect, or I don't like the word prospect, so that your dream client, because that doesn't sound like a person, right? A prospect, but no. So that your dream client knows that you understand how they feel. That's the most important thing. And that's what they teach us in copywriting, is whomever can mirror the pain, or if you don't like to mirror pain, which is the most effective way, but I understand some people don't like it. Some of my clients are like, Kristin, don't use pain points. I'm like, okay, I hear you. So you have to go after the pain or the pleasure of, which is just the pain shaped differently and framed differently, right? It's after the pain that the pleasure comes. So if you can tell a story where you explain how you went from where they are right now in their emotional journey to where they want to be in their emotional journey, they will trust you, because they know you understand how they feel. And they also know when you're faking it and you're a liar. So don't make up a story you think they want to hear. That's never going to work.
Yeah. That is really interesting what you said. I completely forgot even to touch on storytelling, because we were like geeking out on it. With like one thing that I wrote down, and that's something that I was thinking about before, is that because when people think how they should show up online, they think they have to show up as perfect. Everything is like perfection, which it's not the case. But one thing that I over the years I understood is that when you try to show up as like this perfect person, first, people can't really connect to you, because nobody is perfect. So if you show up as perfect person, it's really hard for somebody who is like consuming your content to actually connect to you, because it's really hard to connect with somebody who is perfect or seemingly perfect when you're not perfect yourself. And we all know that we're not perfect. And that gives that, when you show that you're a human, you actually give that connection piece where they can actually connect to you. And I think that's where a lot of times you can build that, like as you said, like that trust and that relationship from there.
Yeah. So that's one of the first things I do with my clients, is I make them tell me several failure stories. And a lot of times they hate it. And I'm like, so
you know why?
They just don't want to talk about it. They think they need to show up as perfect. Okay. And I'm like, no, first of all, if you say you're perfect, you're lying, and you break that trust immediately. No one is going to trust you. And if they even trust you, it's because they don't trust themselves, and it's not going to be a fun interaction, right? It's not going to be a fun client relationship. But I tell them, I'm like, listen, do you want to help people who are struggling right now? And they look at me and they get a little smile on their face and they're like, yes. And I'm like, then you have to be honest about how you struggled too. Was it easy for you to get to where you are? And they're like, no. Was it easy for you to understand the systems you needed to create to help others? No, it wasn't easy. I'm like, okay, well, if you want to be honest, if you want to show them that you are the one to help them, we need to talk about your failures too. And then, they get that smile and the hesitancy drops. But as we're talking, I double check with them because I'm trauma informed. I worked with people who were being rescued out of human trafficking for years. So I understand how to build trust really fast because that's the only way to survive in that kind of environment when you're working with people who have been betrayed so intensely. So they'll start confessing things to me and I have to, I'm their guard, right? I have to make sure that whatever we write, they're actually willing to share and they're comfortable sharing. So sometimes they'll tell me a whole story and I'm like, okay, that story is amazing. I understand why you shared that story, but are you ready to share this story on your website where everyone can see it? And they'll take a pause. And sometimes they'll say, no, I don't want to. And I'm like, okay, we have that story written for whenever you are ready to share about it. Let's do another story because I don't ever want to put I love my clients, first of all, and I never want to put them in a position where they are not ready to talk about something and then we blast it out to the world.
Yeah.
That's not helpful for them.
Have you had experience with some of your stories that you felt like, I don't really want to put it out there?
There are lots of things I don't talk about. And people are always surprised, right? For a long time, I didn't talk about my social anxiety until I felt it was under control in public spaces and online when I showed up. So then when I started talking about it, people would send me messages or they would like call me out in front of everyone. They'd be like, I don't believe you. And I'm like, it's okay. I understand. I show up. I'm really confident. And that's authentic. I believe in myself. I love myself. So I can understand why you wouldn't think that I have social anxiety because I've worked for years to be able to show up. And I had to learn that caring for people was enough for me to suppress the anxiety and to work through it. Because if I don't show up at all, I don't get to build those relationships. And I don't want to live that way. Yeah. So I think, there are things I still haven't talked about a lot. I have not talked a lot about my father-in-law suddenly dying as the result of a skiing accident. And then we had to move from our home in Greece, in Athens, Greece. We packed up everything in 3 days and left on day 4. And that was traumatic. And it's almost
after how many years?
After 7 years.
Yeah.
So that was really hard. And I cried for months, like my eyes were swollen. And it was like we lost someone who was so important to our family that we still are like actively grieving over all the time. And I had to leave what had become my home, where my son was born, where all my friends lived. And it's been almost 5 years and I am starting to talk about it with certain people. And when people ask me about it, instead of saying that's a long story, which means I don't want to talk about it right now, or if they press me, I'll just say, yeah, I'm still processing it, right? It's okay to say no. It's okay to say, I don't feel comfortable talking about that. But as you work through it yourself, you can make it part of your story. And it is a connection piece for me when I meet someone else who has either lost a parent or their spouse has lost a parent. I immediately tell them, I'm so sorry for your loss. Because when that happens to you, that's the only thing you want to hear. You don't want to hear, well, at least this, or, oh, they're in a good place now. You don't care about any of that.
Trying to find these positive things when that's the last thing that you really have on your mind.
Because the pain is for you miss them. And that's something that you can't understand really until you've gone through it. Or I went through it in that I lost my father-in-law, who was a father to me. He was someone in my life who would just call me and check on me. He supported me as a mom. He supported me as a wife. So I was grieving my own loss, but I was, the love of my heart, my soulmate, was experiencing something that was soul shattering for him. And I watched him go through that. So I want to meet that pain with my pain whenever I can in a compassionate and empathetic way. And the people that I've talked to about that, like, we're besties, we're bonded, you know, and not because I hope to do business with them, but because they're a human, I'm a human. And that's something that when, you know, when I'm missing him, I can just text them and they'll know what I mean. I don't have to explain anything. And I think that's one thing about grief we underestimate is how exhausting it is to explain all the time. I have a friend whose husband drowned and he's not around anymore. And she's like, I hate that any new person I meet doesn't know who he is and I have to explain and it's exhausting. And she's like, I like talking to you because I don't have to explain to you. And I'm like, I totally get it. I mean, I haven't lost my spouse, but I understand that explaining in that way can just suck the life right out of you.
And does it also take you back to that, like, you know, a traumatic experience every time you have to explain it or get in there or like describe that?
I think it depends like on the listener. And this is something that's vital for my business too, is I teach people how to listen. Like they always like get pumped up and they're like, let me tell you a story. I've got all these stories. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't matter. I love your stories. I want to hear all your stories, right? But it doesn't matter how great of a storyteller you are if you cannot listen. So if someone is listening to understand, to meet me in my grief, the conversation feels so much better and less fatiguing than if someone just wants me to tell them a list of facts because they're curious. So curiosity is good, but it has to be paired with actual concern and care.
Okay, wait, now I want to understand this. Because that's one of the things that I have found in myself, that for a really long time, I would try to figure out why people trust me, because I would get like first conversation with somebody and they open up to me. They tell some of the like crazy past experiences, traumatic experiences that they have been holding in themselves literally their whole life. And I'm like,
right,
what made you to trust me? Why me? And several things that they said was, and that's the interesting piece is curiosity, because that's one thing that I learned, that when I'm curious, there's no place for judgment. So that's one thing that people said that I don't feel like you're judging me. So I was like, okay. So, and that's when recently when I had the conversation with somebody who was on my podcast, Lisa, I think it's like 21 or 22 episode, I don't remember. But we were having conversation afterwards and we were talking about curiosity. And I said that I understood through another podcast conversation that when you're curious, you're not being judgmental, because judgment comes after you have been curious. Because when you're curious, you're trying to collect the data. You get as much information as you can, then you can sit down and then you can judge good, bad, right, wrong. But I want to discover more about what you said about this like negative curiosity. How does that look like?
So I feel like, and maybe we could call it something else as well. So if we're framing curiosity as a way of like being genuinely interested in recovering data, we can call it that. But let's call the other one, the negative one, fact finding, where you're looking for something because you want something specific. And it could be, I want a sale, or I want to know what this person could do for me, or who they can connect me with. But in a way, and those are natural things to want if you're in business. But if those things take precedence over, I want to know this person as a fellow human being and relate to their experiences, then it doesn't feel good for the other person. It feels gross.
Wait, could it also be something related to, like, let's say in your situation when you said when they're seeking for some kind of gossip information?
Yeah. So actually, or they could be looking for information with which to manipulate you. So if we're talking about narcissistic people, they will seem genuinely interested when they're asking you questions, but all they're interested in is what they can use against you, or what they can use for themselves, or how to gaslight you later, which if you've ever experienced, I can tell a narcissist from a mile away, because that's just my experience growing up. I've been around a lot of narcissists. I've been gaslit, I've been manipulated.
Mhm.
It's a whole long list of things I don't have patience for anymore
Yeah.
now.
Wait, so with this situation, let's say you have two people. One is like genuine, they actually want to, they have this like good curiosity, and the other one
Yeah.
is like narcissist. What are the some things, because you said that initially they listen to you with like interest. So how do
Yeah.
you see what are the signs that, because you're a professional at like noticing narcissists, I assume. So what are the some things that you have seen or you notice that, okay, this is narcissist, even though they are listening, paying attention, asking questions, seemingly being like curious in a good way?
There's going to be this moment of reveal, right? Because they're good at faking it. They pretend they're actively listening. So they might be nodding. They might be saying, oh, yes. And they might be encouraging you along the way. Their body language is not going to present itself as aggressive to you. But then there will come a moment when they're going to respond. And normally a narcissist will respond in an abrupt way where they focus in on one thing you said that interests them instead of trying to understand what you said as a whole. And they'll grill you about that one thing. Like they won't
Okay.
drop it. So you can tell, like, as soon as they respond that way, for me, I'm like, okay, I'm out. I'll be like, oh, it was so nice to meet you. And I move on.
Yeah.
Or if it's someone that I'm related to, I'm like, okay, well, let's not talk about this right now because I can tell you're really thinking about this. So why don't you just tell me about that? If it's someone that, I have boundaries with, so I'm not exposing myself for an unlimited amount of time and I have to interact with them. Or I choose, because I never have to interact with anyone, but I choose to keep some narcissist in my life because removing them completely, I feel would be more damaging to me or to them.
Why?
Because they are doing the best they can with
Okay.
what they have, and what they've learned. And especially for older people, it's almost impossible to reprogram that part of their brain.
Yeah.
So they are doing the best they can to genuinely interact with you. But maybe they don't have the social skills or they don't have the awareness about what
Awareness
they're
is
doing.
huge.
And even if you tell them they're doing it, they probably won't know. Like, even because their narcissism blocks them from understanding that. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And that's something that you see with so many times. When one response a lot of times is when you say somebody that they're doing this or that, they close off and they go in defense mode. But sometimes when they are not in that defense mode, when you say that you're doing this or that, they literally they don't see that. And it might be just, and it's something that you were talking about before, about when we were talking about like haters and fans and stuff like that, that it's all perspective. So they don't have this perspective where they're able to see that as, oh, this is something I'm actually doing. Where I think maybe big part is played by empathy, ability to feel empathy or be empathetic. Is that the word?
Yeah, no, that's right.
Where you actually are able to imagine how whatever you say might make the other person feel or do. And that's something that, do you think that empathy is a skill or it's like a trait?
I think it's both. Some people are naturally more empathetic. And I actually have a friend who is a doctor who talks about this because she's like, there's no such thing as an empath. And I'm like, okay, explain more. And she's like, we have highly sensitive people. That's different, but you aren't born with a certain amount of empathy. You can always learn more empathy. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm tracking with this. I can go with this. So I think you can develop empathy, and that's something that has been a really huge priority for my husband and I with our kids, because we have 3 kids, a 15-year-old and 13-year-old girls, and then a 10-year-old boy. And we work with them on empathy all the time. And it doesn't always work, actually, because you have to be willing to be empathetic. And I think one of the things that helps either cement your journey down empathy or block your journey with empathy is life experience. And my kids are young. And so they get to choose how they interact with the world and they can either feel like I want to understand that person more and relate to them on an emotional level, or I'm angry and bitter that they did that, and I'm going to carry that with me, and the other person walks away without any of that damage. And that's, it doesn't make sense, but our humanness comes out for good or for bad. And sometimes we decide I'm going to stay angry about this instead of I'm going to either attempt healthy communication and let it go, or the other person cannot have healthy communication, so I'm going to let it go.
Yeah, and that's where I think a lot of times it's important to monitor the person that you're actually having conversation with.
Yes.
Even when it comes to having conversation about something where, let's say, we disagree, or you have different opinion than I do, which is something that a lot of times I actually like to talk to people who think differently, because I like to understand why they think that way, or is there something that they know that I don't know? Because I think one way, but it doesn't mean that this is the right way. So if I learn how they think, I might in the end disagree still, but at least I can understand their perspective. So I don't really like judge them for however they think, not even judge, but I can actually understand why. And it makes sense to me. And I'm like, oh yeah, it makes sense, but I still disagree, but that's where it's important to monitor, let's say, the person that you're talking to, whether they're in a mindset where they're actually open to having discussion and listening. I don't talk about, like, let's say somebody trying to convince me that I'm thinking wrong or whatever. I'm like, I'm okay with hearing your opinion or you explaining why you think my opinion is wrong. But if that's the only way that you're doing it, where you're sticking to this one gun that you have, then we are not really having conversation. We're just now trying to debate, or like I'm now trying to, like it's just convincing without having like proper conversation. And that's where a lot of times, like, I remember I had time when I would be like, okay, so I will now go into this conversation. I kind of know where it's going, but still, I want to see if I can have it like productive conversation. And the one way that actually works with this kind of people is don't talk about your opinion, just make them talk about theirs. So now you just make them talk, ask them questions. And that's one thing that I learned, is that now instead of us having this conversation, I just focus on understanding you, because they love to talk about themselves. They just want to convince that their thing is the right thing. So now if I know that's where they stand, okay, we just talk about this thing. Why do you think this? Or like, how did you come to this conclusion about this and that? And now you're so focused on them that they kind of not necessarily forget to attack you back, but they don't really have anything to attack because you don't give anything to attack.
Right. I know they talk about this. There's a new episode of Charisma on Command on YouTube where they just take this idea apart, where even if you disagree with someone, you just go back and talk about the common ground and ask questions, right? Be curious. And I always like to say, I'm glad to be wrong. And that's true. I am glad to find out when I'm wrong so that I can adjust my perspective, because I'm open to it. And I have that same sort of thing where I'm like, I feel like I know where this conversation is going. I'll just give an example, because I lived in Europe for on and off for 10 years, right? People know that I lived in a socialist country, and in America, socialism is a bad word, even though we have so many socialist systems. I won't get sidetracked by that, but I'm like, we do have these systems in our, democratic republic. And so people will want to attack me over that. And their perspective is, you lived in a place that I think is wicked because of this one thing. So I want you to validate that. And then when I don't, they get mad. But I'm like, your whole purpose in this conversation wasn't to understand me or my experience living in a socialist country. It was to validate your own opinion at whatever
been there
cost.
Themselves?
No, of course not.
Even better.
Of course. And so they're like, well, what about this? And I'm like, I tell stories. I'm like, well, when I lived in Greece and I had a cyst growing in my sinus cavity, I went to the emergency room, and do you know who I saw right away? And they look at me and I'm like, a neurosurgeon. Do you know how long it would take me to see a neurosurgeon in the US? It would be weeks or months of referrals and paperwork. And so I went and I saw the neurosurgeon right away. They sent me to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and they treated the cyst and it went away.
Yeah.
Like in the course of 3 days. So how is that bad? Right? That's my question. But then they just don't want to answer the question, or they'll disengage, or they'll bring up some other thing. And I'm like, okay, I love
because
you.
they now see that, okay, I can't attack you for this. Like it's actually not going anywhere where I want it to go, which is most of the
Right.
times I'm looking for arguments. So what's next?
Right. And then I'll ask about their kids, right? That's what I'm like, let's just divert the conversation because I care about you as a person. I can see this is upsetting to you. I'm not going to be able to help you work through this feeling you have right now because you're not open to working through it.
Yeah.
So let's move on to something else.
Okay, so speaking of your experience in Europe, like what would you say are the differences between living in America and Europe? And how do you even get to going there and living there? Let's start
Yeah.
there.
It's a small short story. No, so how did we get there? My husband and I were working and doing different jobs. He was working as a police officer and he actually got really sick. He got diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is an autoimmune disease he will have the rest of his life. And he's been managing it this whole time since then. Well, let's see. So it's been 14 years that he's been managing that. And we both always felt like we wanted to do humanitarian work. Like even before we got married, I was like, I'm going to do humanitarian work. And he's like, I don't know anything about that. I don't want to move to another country. But then he went on a trip to New Zealand with his dad after he graduated college. And he met some humanitarian workers there and they actually stayed in their house with them instead of staying in a hotel. And he was like, okay, I see yes, let's do this. And I was like, perfect. We hadn't even gotten married yet. So I was like, all right, he understands. He knows why this is so amazing. And so
how did you know that you want to do that?
I was just open to it. I met a lot of people who had been doing it when I was, like when I was 17, I started meeting people who had done it and I realized, oh, I'm interested in this. I had actually been planning to move to Laos as an English teacher when I met my husband, and my parents were relieved. They thought that getting married meant I wouldn't move anywhere. So then when we had been talking, and actually at the time when we decided it, I had just found out I was pregnant with our second daughter. And we decided as soon as she's born, we're going to go to this school where they'll teach us how to be humanitarian workers in another country. That's how we ended up in Hungary. The school's no longer there. But at that time, we had our 8-week daughter and our 2.5-year-old daughter, and we hopped on a plane and everyone thought we were crazy.
How did you do that? Even when you were talking previous about making that change when you went from Europe back to US, how do you deal with big change? Because that's literally like you completely leave your life that you have here and you go to like across the world, really.
I think awareness is the key also in that situation, because culture shock will happen. It's going to happen, especially if you move somewhere where your language is not the language they speak. And I just have to shout you out right now, because English is not your first language and you have such a amazing command of it. You're doing a podcast episode in English. I would never be able to do a podcast episode in Greek. Never, never, never.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how long I studied it. It just won't stick in my brain that way, even though I lived around it. And some people can't learn languages. That's just the truth, right? Like, no matter how hard you try, some people have a natural ability. If you're younger, it helps because your brain is more able to take in those other ways of communication. But so it's going to hurt. You go there knowing it's going to hurt, and you also go there with hope, and you find things you love, and you have to be open to being wrong. That's it, because everything that you learn that seems like this is the only way to do this, the truth is there's probably 50 ways to do it, and you're only using one. And if you can be open to that, you're going to gain an entire toolbox of creativity that you didn't know existed in the world.
Yeah. So, okay, so you moved there. So what happens afterwards? How do you even settle in? Like, did you have culture shock? If you did, how did it look? Like,
Yeah.
what was like initial experience as you went there?
Well, we had a lot of English speakers there, people from the States. So it was a
Mhm.
lot of English speakers, but then there was a whole group of Hungarians, and we decided from the very beginning, we're like, we don't just want to get to know people from America. That's not why we're here. The whole reason we're
Mhm.
here is to learn how to be cross-cultural and to interact with people whose culture and experiences are different, whose language is different. So we learned as much Hungarian as we could, which was pathetic, honestly. But we would hang out with the Hungarians that we could, and we would try to speak some Hungarian with them, some English with them. Some of them were fluent in English. We actually ended up making our best friends there, which
Mhm.
is they're both Hungarian. Well, one is Hungarian. It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because one was born in Yugoslavia, which no longer exists. So she's Serbo-Hungarian Croatian. Her mom's from Croatia. So that's my best friend. And then her husband is my husband's best friend, and he is Hungarian. But he was also previously married to an American. So his English is like,
Mhm.
when we play Scrabble, we all get like 300 plus points because my friend Andi, the wife, and her best friend was his previous wife who died in a tragic
Mhm.
car accident. So a couple years after she died, they ended up realizing, oh, we actually like each other romantically, and they started a family. But she's an English teacher. Like, she
Mhm.
teaches, actually she translates now for a huge Hungarian media that's
Mhm.
not controlled by their fascist regime. So she gets to translate that into English for English readers like me, who are like, yay, finally I can read about this in English, because my Hungarian is awful. I would say non-existent is the accurate term. So we just spent time with nationals, right?
Mhm.
That's what you do. And when we realized we wanted to go to Greece because they were having the economic crisis, that's also what we did, is we spent time with nationals. We made friends. Unfortunately for us, all of our friends spoke English and they wanted to practice English with us, which means we didn't really get to learn Greek.
Mm.
But our kids were fluent in Greek. They went to Greek school because the English school was like far and expensive. And why? We wanted to be we wanted to learn as much as we could
Mhm.
from this group of resilient people who, even if they only have one piece of bread left in their house and they know you're hungry, they'll give it to you.
Yeah.
You don't see that in the same way in the United States, in my opinion. There
Yeah.
are people, but it's not like anyone would do that. You know what I mean?
Mhm. So as you were talking, I wrote down assumptions. Did you have any assumptions when you were traveling there, how people will be or what will be different and stuff like that as you were going there? And did they become true? Or if not, what about them wasn't true?
I think most of our assumptions were wrong. I think that's part of it. Is when you go somewhere else and you're uncomfortable and everything is different, you have two choices. You can retreat into yourself and you can get angry that everything's wrong,
Yeah.
or you can be curious about why everything is different and
Mm-hmm.
explore and open up those ideas you had that maybe weren't formed in a place that they could grow to the size they needed to be. And so we unlearned patriotism. I would say that patriotism is negative,
Mm-hmm.
and that causes a lot of people to get mad at me. I would
So
also
why is it that
say,
you see it as negative? Like what's the reason behind it?
because I think that it's focused on one thing too much,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like, personally, I would say that the United States' politics are broken, like severely broken,
Mm-hmm.
like much more broken than I've seen in other countries. I mean, in our city, they're especially
Mm-hmm.
broken as well. But so, and I couldn't realize that until I went somewhere else. And I was like, oh, Greece has a parliament that is like, when they vote, there's like 13 parties. that are engaged with each other. And then they make a majority out of different parties. And it's pretty cool. I'm not saying it's perfect,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't think that any systems we can make as humans will be perfect
No.
because we're imperfect. But it was interesting to me. And also, it's not so polarizing. Politics in other countries are not as polarizing as we have in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. And my husband and I both realized like politics are not even really that important. Right. Like, and we both work at our local election so that people can vote because we believe that you should vote if
Mm-hmm.
you feel strongly about something, you have that option, do it. And otherwise, like they were like, we don't know what to do. We don't have anyone to run the polls. So we were like, okay, we'll do it
Mm-hmm.
because we want that right for people. But in some elections, I don't even feel compelled to vote and I'm fine with it. And, 20 years ago, like old me would have been like, oh, that's shocking. What do you mean there are some things you don't want to vote on? You're doing everything wrong. You're not being a patriot. You're not, doing justice to your government. And you're not treating your country like it's the best country in the world. And, a lot of people in the US will say that. And it's awful. It is awful to say that. And I had to learn that it was awful to say that because I didn't
Yeah.
know. I thought, oh, everyone feels that way about their country. And to some part, like to some extent, that is true. Usually the place where you have citizenship, where you grew up, you care about it. And that makes sense. But that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean you have to exclude every other place in the world and say that, oh, it's not good
Yeah.
just because it's different.
Yeah, that's a good point. If it doesn't mean that if it's different, then it's wrong or it's bad or
Right.
something like that. How would you define patriotism?
So I would say that patriotism to me means that you blindly or almost blindly accept things about your country, about your government as acceptable or good just because it's the country that you're from.
Yeah. Well, then it makes sense why you have that standing.
And I
It
think
sounds
that
a lot
is,
like brainwashing.
I mean, it looks a lot like brainwashing for a lot of people. And it's not just, we have the right and the left, which, first of all, that's problematic language because one of those words is a synonym for correct. So that's not good. And
Yeah.
both of them are like wrong, in my opinion. I'm what most people would call a moderate. And a lot of people are like, how can you be a person of faith and also be a moderate? And I'm like, okay, if we're going to get into all that, I would say that Jesus definitely did not choose government sides or topple any governments or any of that.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's what he would do now, and that's not what I'm going to do. But it's one of those things where people naturally associate a good or bad character to you based on whether or not you agree with them on one of these polarized sides. And that's problematic. That causes
So
all
in a way,
sorts
like
of
they initially put you in like specific category now. Oh, you're this, so it means that you must be this kind of person.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
And to the point where they're like, I can't even talk to you. And we can't stop communication because of something that is honestly created by rich people to make sure they keep their money and their power. If we're being honest, that's what our government is. That's what most governments are.
You know what's the interesting thing about the different groups? That's something that we were in university we were taught that there was a research. I don't remember what groups they were talking about, but pretty much like you had two different groups, let's say two different citizens from different countries. Initially, you think that you have more things in common with people in your group. It makes sense, we're from the same group. But what they found is that you actually have more similar things with people in the other group than you do with the people in your group. So now we get so associated with this group that we now think that actually I'm more alike, or this is because we have this one thing in common. Now we have this connection point. So now we actually have more in common than we think we do. But actually you have more in common with this other group or people in other group. So that was a really interesting thing that when the lecturer was talking about it, I was like, wow, I have never thought about it. And now I'm starting to look at groups differently. That even the fact that even your case, you might actually have more in common with people in like Europe than you might have in people in like America. And you
Yeah.
might never even notice that if you didn't go there, because naturally, if we don't go or explore different places, we have these assumptions. They're like this, they're like that, or whatever, until you go there and you actually put yourself in that environment and you see that it might actually not be the case. And you might actually have more in common with those people than you have with people around you where you were born. And that's I think that's where assumptions, it's good to have kind of assumptions, or our brains like to categorize things, but at the
Yes.
same time it can do a lot of disservice when it goes a bit too far, or we actually act on them or don't explore a possibility that some of them might be wrong.
Yeah, I love that. And for me, I had to go to a place where the boxes where the compartments that I grew up with didn't exist for them to be able to break open.
Yeah.
It took that like really different environment, and like that changes. So my husband and I always joke, like, we're not European enough to be European, and now we're not, we have American, right? That's what
Yeah.
we call our in the United States, but there are lots of other countries in America, so it doesn't make sense. But we have, we don't fit into the United States anymore either. We're wanderers in a strange land, essentially. But that's not a bad place to be, and it helps me to understand other people better. It helps me to be curious about
Yeah.
the stories I hear, because some of the stories I've lived have changed me as a person. So I know how powerful they are.
Yeah. And I think I kind of can relate to what you're saying, because I don't really feel like, let's say, my home country, that this is it, or like I can identify with that fully. There's still something that this is home, but at the same time, it's not like this is like home, or I
Right.
don't really feel like I fully fit in. And same when I was in UK, I kind of felt like, oh, this is something that I can sort of kind of connect with, but at the same time, I can't. And that's where I think that, in a way, the broader your perspective becomes, the more you become, I think, in a way, more like the citizen of the world.
Yeah.
You don't really identify with one thing or the other, but you have a bit of both, or like more than two. But that's where, like, I think, and that, in a way, I think that so many people kind of see that as a bad thing, that you don't really have this place where you feel like, oh, this is where I belong, this is where I fit in. Well, it doesn't mean that you have to have this place. You might be still looking for it, or if you don't have it, it doesn't mean that now you're like completely lost or it's a bad thing. You're still exploring. We all are just exploring. And if you're now used to this one location, it doesn't mean that now there isn't a better one, because you're used to this. And that's something that is common with everything, not just about where you live or anything like that, but even your life situation. If you're used to this life situation, it doesn't mean that there isn't a better one out there, or there isn't the next level. But we're so used to this, but this is comfortable, this is good,
Yeah.
I'd rather stay where it's good. But speaking of, you said that you changed as well, as you were living there. And that's something that I wanted to ask you. What are some things that you have noticed in yourself that you have changed as a person from your time living there? Or here,
Yeah.
I'm in Europe.
I know. I mean, well, and I actually live in a place I didn't grow up in. Now I grew up in Los Angeles, and I live in Pennsylvania, which is on the other side of the country, and the culture is different than Los
Yeah.
Angeles. So I've been in so many different cultures now. And I agree with you about that feeling that people have when you don't just identify with one place. They think it's bad.
Yeah.
And I think maybe they just don't, because they don't understand it, they automatically sort it into the negative
Yeah.
category.
And I think
But
they only have this perspective of what they know. I fit in here. So I can't really understand, how can you not fit in here or fit in one place, because they have been in one place their whole life.
right. And like what we would call my kids is their third culture kids. They grew up in a culture that wasn't the culture of their parents. But also, like, my kids would get bullied at school for being American in Greece, because people didn't understand why Americans would be there, right? Even when you explain it, they're like, I don't understand. And And also, to be fair, they're naturally suspicious of people from other countries because they've been occupied so many times as part of their cultural
Oh yeah.
heritage. So, and you can come into that as an adult with understanding, but for kids, that's a different process. And we had to work through that. So, and I think that is one of the things that changed about me is I learned how important history is. And, you know, the saying is the victor writes the history book. And to
Yeah.
look past what is easy to find, like my friends gave us this whole book on the history of the Balkans, which is hard to find, right? It's hard to find a comprehensive history of the breakdown of that group of countries over and over again for centuries. And when you read it and you meet a Balkan person, you understand them so much better because you know where they're coming from in a sense. You know their generational story because they don't exist in a vacuum and we don't exist, you know, on our own. And I think that's what I learned is that it's complicated. It's so complicated.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to admit that there are things you don't understand, you're much more able to meet someone with different experiences where they are on their journey, which is different than your journey, in a way that you can listen and understand and find common ground, even though your experiences and your cultures and even your language might be very different.
And that's one thing that I actually like about these different cultures, because even when I was in UK, I would have friends. It's so ironic that most of my friends actually weren't British. they were all over the world, from different countries. And I would really do my best to understand their culture, because I had a friend who was, I don't remember which country he was from, but he would like make a dinner and we would sit on the ground and we would eat it from the ground. And he would also explain me certain things that, and I'm curious, I like to understand stuff. So we had this like huge dish that we were eating from. And when, let's say there's like several of us, but as we were getting close to the middle of the dish, I asked him, so what happens with the middle piece? Because like, it doesn't feel like nice to just take it for yourself. And he said, what we usually do is that we actually push it forward to the other person. And I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting thing. And
so nice.
they're like these kind of small things that people from other cultures do, that even one of my course mates, she was on the first podcast episode. And she's crazy strong mentally. She survived multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And she was doing that while she was studying in uni. So, and she finished uni as well. So
that's
she's
amazing.
Like, yeah, that's why I had her on. I'm like, I want to hear more about you, really. And with her, I remember, I don't remember which year of uni it was, but we would just like meet up in a cafe and we would have a conversation where literally I would just ask her questions about, she's Muslim, about like her like religion, because I really wanted to understand it. And she was like, she afterwards said to me like, this is so nice to have conversation with somebody about this, where like you're not part of my culture. You like, that's not something that you are, but it's nice to have a conversation with somebody where you actually try to understand it, or you try to like, you ask questions and I can explain you stuff and things like that. And I'm like, isn't that what it's supposed to be? Like, it's you have these assumptions about certain people that, because I don't know, let's say because they have certain like religion or whatever, that they're this or that. And I'm like, okay, but let me figure it out first myself. I want to actually have a conversation with this person and see if it's actually true, because anybody can tell you anything. But if you believe everything that some like whoever says to you, you can end up really not having your own opinion, or your opinion now is based on something that you heard somewhere or somebody said to you, that most of the times we don't really know this person to start with. And that's why, and I think that curiosity piece, that's something that has helped me a lot to be more open-minded, because now I'm like, as I said before, I'm not thinking now what's wrong or what's right, or oh, this is not in alignment with what I believe or what I think. But instead I'm like, okay, I want to understand why, like, how is it that you think? How is it that like this even came along, or what's like some of your values, or that this and that. And then as I learned that, I'm like, wow, this actually is so interesting. And you see that person in completely different perspective than you might see people of that group, let's say,
Right.
online, or whatever people tell to you, which most of the times it's something they got from online anyways.
Oh,
And
the,
that's where, yeah, and that's where you can see all these like differences that people, I think that's similar to what I said about these different groups, that online you see this like big difference that people kind of highlight. This is the big
Mhm.
difference. This is the bad difference that they have from us. That's why they're bad. But have you had a conversation with that person where you actually see that we have much more in common, and you actually are pretty cool like person, like I actually
Yeah,
like you as a
like I want
person.
to be your friend. Right. I think that's part of the problem with, so there are lots of great things about the internet. There are lots of horrible things about the internet. And one of the horrible things is that you feel the safety to sling your opinion out at someone else as if they're not a fellow human being.
Yeah.
But they are. And they're complicated, just like
Yeah.
you're complicated, just like I'm complicated, right? We have to take those things into consideration before we inform ourselves. We have to understand other perspectives. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the, you know, I want to say white hostility toward Black people. And yes,
Mhm.
I'm using extreme language because I see it, where I hear people that I care about saying things like, well, their experience wasn't so bad. And I'm like, well, how many of them have you talked to? Because I've heard some pretty intense stories
Yeah.
of things that have happened in the last year, right? It's not 100 years ago. It's not 200, 300 years ago. It's still recent. And so, but if you don't talk to anyone from a group who is not in your group, then you don't have to deal with those facts. So you can have whatever opinion you want guilt-free.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the internet is it facilitates a way to do that without any connection.
Oh yeah. And one thing that I like to say people, well, I don't really talk to people who are hating online, but I like to think this way, that don't write something online that you wouldn't say that person in the face. So if we
Yes.
were now face to face, you won't say that. Or even don't say behind somebody's back something that you can't say in their face, because you never know. They might hear that. Somebody else might say them about it. So never say something that you're not ready to say to somebody in the face, because it doesn't really lead anywhere. Like, okay, you might feed your ego as you talk behind their back. Now you're just like cool person, or like you're better than them or whatever. But at the same time, like, it doesn't give you it. Most of the time people can sense that, okay, if you now talk bad stuff about this person, you probably will talk something bad about me behind my back. That's a pattern there. It's not like
Right.
a common thing.
You're revealing your character to be less than what people expect it to be, actually, right?
Yeah. And as people talk, like, that's something that I now instantly see, that is that if I talk to somebody and they're now talking something bad or gossiping about somebody else, I know that most likely they will do that, but that about me, because it's just who they are. And that's how they, in a way, that's their perspective, that's their reality, that's how they, I don't know, feed their ego or make them feel good about themselves. Because it's harder to go out there and do something than it is to talk shit about somebody else.
Right. And we
It's
had
just how it
like
is.
my husband and I went through this whole stage of that where we were like actively speaking about things and people came at us and they're like, well, what are you doing? And we would tell them what we're doing privately, right? We don't have to broadcast everything in our lives on the internet. And then they would just be quiet because they couldn't argue. They're like, okay, well, if you're doing these things and you're seeing this, then it's good what you're doing, is usually how the conversation ended. And then we realized, okay, we've had all the meaningful conversations we can about this on this platform, and then we just backed away from it. And
Yeah.
it's been much more healthy. But when that's one of my boundaries, honestly, if I find out someone saying something about me behind my back and it's someone that I have a relationship with and they didn't come to me to talk to me about it, I will go to them and I'll be like, I heard you said this from this person. Is that what happened? I never assume that anything
Yeah.
is what someone else says. I always want to ask first. And they'll be
Yeah.
like, well, I did say this, this, and this. I didn't say it like that. Or, yes, that's exactly how I said. And I was like, well, why didn't you just come to me and talk to me about it? And like the way the conversation works is if we get to the end of the conversation and they assert their right to talk about me behind my back, I'm like, okay, well, you of course are able to do that, but I'm not going to give you any more information with which to do that
Yeah.
because we're no longer talking. Like that's my boundary. I do not want to take part in this. And if you are so determined to do it, I respect your right to do that,
Yeah.
but I don't want it. So we're going to part ways. And a lot of times they'll just say, okay, fine. And I never talk to them again.
Yeah.
But that's their right. But it's my right also to say, I don't want that in my life anymore.
Yeah. And actually, sometimes just having this kind of conversation can make them aware that, oh, this is what I'm doing. Like sometimes I don't even notice that they do that. And when you have this person coming back to you, you're like, first you get this like, oh shit, she knows what I said. That's like the initial reaction. It actually
Right.
got to her.
Yeah.
So she actually like found out this information. So now you're in this like super uncomfortable situation, which by itself can be so uncomfortable that you now don't want to even entertain possibility it's ever getting in that position. But also you can see from when you have a conversation with somebody, especially if it's something that hurt them and they come to you and they say, you know what, like, if this is something that you said, like it really hurts. It's not a nice thing to hear. And it makes me feel like really bad about like whatever. And that's where they can connect whatever they did, that consequences to that action is that person actually
Yes.
being hurt. And I think that's where a lot of times online you don't really see that, because most of us,
Right.
we are not, we don't really want to entertain like the haters and stuff like that. And we just keep moving on. But like even when I had one of my cold plunge videos take off with like 2 million views on TikTok, I had many people who were writing some negative stuff as well. And I did my best to actually respond to all of them, at least to most comments that I got. And some of them, I didn't, usually I responded to them with this idea that they might have this, they might have something that I don't see or I don't know. So whenever I would write something to them, so like whenever I would send message back, a lot of times their response would be like, oh, I actually didn't mean it that way. And that's another thing that I have noticed with messages online is that when you have face-to-face conversation, you see instant reactions to what you say. And you can instantly respond back and ask them, is this what you meant? And they're like, no, that's actually not what I meant. And that's something that I have done before, is that when somebody sends me a message, there was like one emoji who is like a smiley face, but it has like, you see the teeth. And
oh yeah,
for me, it feels like a laughing emoji. So somebody sent a message to me, and that emoji, for me, it felt like you're laughing at me. And I said, like, I feel like this emoji is kind of like, are you laughing at me? And they're like, no, I felt it. I actually meant it as like smiley emoji. And I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. But like, if I didn't have that response
question.
back, now I
Yeah.
start to assume that, oh, they're making fun of me or like whatever. But most of the times people don't, or sometimes people are not even aware of how the specific way how they put the words together, which is another thing that I wrote down, that you're obsessed with language, the specific way how you put the word. And I kind of am the same way with like being really precise with like the way you say things or the order, stuff like that. But like the way you put the words, the person reading, they can get offended, or they can actually get it as a compliment, depending on the person. So that's where whenever you post something online or wherever you comment something online, which most people don't really care about this, but that's something that I have seen, is that you have to be really careful of how you actually formulate what you're saying, because there's so many ways how you can now misinterpret it. Because
it's true.
Like there's like, I just read few sentences. I don't hear your intonation. the way you're
No.
saying it.
You
Or
can't see any
exactly.
physicality, right? There's no body language. Yeah, communication is so interesting. And I'm like that where like maybe some of my comments are too long because I'm over explaining, but I would rather have that than I made a comment and they're like, well, what does that mean? I don't want that response.
Yeah. Or they just get triggered and they're like, oh, you this and that. Where actually you meant good. But that's where, and that's something that I usually I think I had similar thing where, let's say, I would respond, and but it's mainly in like messages, not as much like comments, where I would respond like quite long. And the person's like, why are you responding so long? And I'm like, because I want to make sure you actually understand right what I meant in that message. So I have to
Right.
write it in a way that you can't like not understand it, because I want to make sure you actually understand what I meant. Because I'm really aware of like communication, things like that. I have been learning about that like for a really long time, and how easy it is to literally like, especially with text.
And
I can
text is the
send one
worst.
thing and you read it completely
Like
differently.
that's why, and like I got in a fight with someone the other day on text. Well, like I say fight. We got into a discussion, as my Greek friends will call it, a
Yeah.
discussion. Where I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like I was like, well, okay, this is fine, but you do it because I don't want to do this. And then they were like, I was joking, and I was like, I have told you before that I do not get sarcasm in text. Like I do not understand sarcasm in text.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Sarcasm
it's
especially.
really hard to like without any intonation, without any expression, right? Like, and so the person responded, they're like, I know you don't, but it's one of the things I can't stop doing. And I'm like, okay, so we just know we're going to get in fights about this then, right? Like, and they were like, yeah, it's okay. I was like, all right, well, I told you, you told me, we know this is a bad idea, but apparently we can't stop it from happening.
Yeah, and that's where, and most of the times people don't even are not really that good at like communicating in real life. Not even talking about messages. But like getting back to communication, you mentioned before about listening, that one of the most important things to learn is to listen. Or let's say when you kind of try to communicate this message, do you have any advice on like how to improve listening skills, or like just start to listen better?
Well, I'm sure this is going to shock you, but you need to be authentically curious,
Yeah.
right? Like
Oh,
have
it
it
doesn't shock
be
me.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like
Makes
we've been
sense.
talking about this the whole time. Like that's the key, is to really want to know the person better. And if it's like, let's say it's in a business interaction, right? Because this is the kind of thing that I'm coaching people with. And I'm not a coach, but
Yeah.
if you work with me, I want to help you make money. So I'm going to tell you how to do that.
Mhm.
Because the writing that I do for you is great, but if you can't deliver when you're talking to
Yeah.
someone, it doesn't matter how great I write for you. So I teach my clients how to listen. And in a business interaction, you want to, there are different things we're listening for, but we want to understand what the person's goals are. And sometimes, even though they're articulating something, they can't even express what their goals are. So
Yeah.
you're listening for little hints. And when you're
Yeah.
listening for hints, your attention goes like to 100. Because if you miss like the slightest thing, and a lot of times, honestly, people cannot market for themselves. It's a very specific profession to have. It takes a lot of training. So you're like, I want this thing. And so I'm doing this. And what I'm like, okay, that's like 5 steps ahead of where your customer is right now. So let's go back. Like, how can we
Mhm.
get them to understand who you are and what you can help them do? But you don't prioritize 5 steps from where you're thinking. So I'm listening so intensely because
Yeah.
I know you're going to say the thing that your client is having a problem with that you don't think is a big deal. And that's where we need to start. So it's like
Mm.
a puzzle that you're trying to unlock, and the other person's not going to come right out and say the exact thing that you need to hear in order to start the work. So
Yeah.
you have to be like a little question detective in order to get the meaningful work done. And you cannot do that if you don't know how to listen for what they mean instead of just listening for what they're saying.
Yeah. Listening between the lines. And that is something that I think I have learned over the years, but like practicing communication skills, how important listening is, because so many things that when you actually sit down and focus just on listening, you will hear so much. Like you have
Yes.
no idea how much you can hear when you actually focus on listening. And also that person will feel heard, because now you're not
Exactly.
like, I think one way how I usually describe it is that when you listen to somebody, you approach them as a blank page, that now you don't have any of like your beliefs or your like perspectives, anything like that. You actually focus on them and you draw a picture based on what they say to you, not what you think, what you believe, but what they say. And then you can actually understand them better, because you don't kind of mess it all up with whatever you think, whatever you believe, stuff like that. You actually draw this picture just from what they say. And it's so interesting that the more you start to focus on listening, on what they say, and that's something that many times when I have conversations with people, even about like networking, stuff like that, where I'm like, I'm not an expert in that, but people ask me like, oh, I have all these like networking conversations, they're so serious and it's so much fun with you, and I'm like, oh, all my conversations are like pretty fun, you know.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I learned is that when, well, big thing with networking for me was because like I'm like naturally an introvert, that when I would approach somebody, and that's something that I learned from one live event that I was on, that I would literally notice that I'm leaning in, I'm listening to that person, and he's not even here physically.
Right.
And I would be like writing chat and responding, and I usually don't do that stuff. And I was like, okay, what was it about him that made me do that? And I realized that it was his energy, and also the fact that he expected you to engage.
Yes. He
So when you
invited
have that expectation, that's where you actually show up. And that's where I started to see, okay, that's where I started to, let's say when I have conversations with somebody, like networking, I would actually approach them instead of as a stranger, where with strangers like, hey, how are you? What do you do? You know, like kind of awkward. You can't really predict what they're going to say, how they respond, because you don't really know them.
Right.
But more as a friend, because with a friend, you already have this expectation that they like you. They actually like to talk to you. They like to spend time with you. So now when you approach them as a friend, they actually respond back, because they kind of pick up that energy. And that's where I started to see that, oh, so many people actually are awesome to connect to. But that's when I started to think, is it because, well, naturally they are awesome, but it might also be because I show up different way, where they can be that person, they can show that side of them. And that's where, and that's something that I keep telling people is that even when it comes to communication or relationships, it takes one person. Because I had a client who had she had like anger issues, and I said to her, we have had many sessions, you haven't get angry with me. And I don't
Right.
really get much like conversations in my life where we are now like shouting or like throwing stuff or whatever people do when they
Yeah.
get angry. And I said to her, it takes one person, because if one person is able to regulate themselves good enough, the other person will kind of react back to that. Because what will you do? You will now shout at me when I'm calm and collected and actually trying to resolve the situation
Right.
normally. You won't.
You won't. No.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I said to her. It takes one person a lot of times, but we think that, oh, this person is this or that. And I'm like, start with yourself, and you will see how much things start to change when you start to change yourself and how you approach or show up.
It's true. And, it's that opportunity. Yeah, I love that. And I found that to be true too. Like and I'm extremely introverted, and talking to other people can be intensely draining for me, especially depending on the person. I won't say which one of my children, but one of my children can drain me completely in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Just based on their personality. It has nothing to do with them being amazing or not. Of course, they're amazing, but just like the level of the communication is so intense for me. I'm like, go talk to your dad, because he's an extrovert, right? But one of the things that I've learned to do is I started out my career. My first job out of college was I worked for a school that specialized in helping people with reading problems. It was a dream job for me because I'm obsessed with storytelling. I love reading. And one of the things that we did with all the students from kindergarten all the way to adult was we taught them how to do tellbacks. And all a tellback is is when you tell back something that you've just read. And I realized I can do this with conversation. And so now that's what I do. Like I come with my blank page, I take notes,
Yeah.
and then I say, let me see if I've gotten this right. I'm going to read something I wrote based on what you said, and you can tell me if I need to adjust it. And that's with the expectation of what I've written probably isn't complete. And so I read it to them. And a lot of times they'll say, oh, this would be complete if we just add this one word, if we just put this one thing. And that's what makes it. And also, they learned that I was listening to what they said to the point where I could communicate it back for clarification. And that builds know, like, and trust right there, like in that one moment.
Oh, yeah. In psychology, I think it's called paraphrasing. And that's something that we were taught, where I had the 1 year I was studying in Latvia psychology before I went to UK to study sports psychology. And we had really interesting thing that only people who were studying psychology, that 2 days before we even started the school, we had these like exercises that we had to go through all day, several exercises and one of them was different kinds of communication. And we would go like from, in a way, like we were in a circle, and we would just change the partner that we would talk to depending on the exercise. And paraphrasing was one of the things. And it was so interesting also that how important that is, because it's, in a way, it makes so much sense, but it's not really that common for people to do that. Because now when you say something, I naturally assume that I understood what you said. I understood. I heard you. I hear you. I get it.
Yeah.
Like, I understand what you said, But
Yeah.
it's important to make sure that they actually understood it right. If what I understood actually is what you meant. And that's what I do with like what you explained, is that you ask them. And that's where you can see, oh, actually, I was a bit off.
Yes.
And that's something that it makes so much sense, because naturally we just want to think, oh, like I get it. Especially, let's say in marriage, you have been together like for a really long time. Oh, I know what you're thinking.
Right.
It's like,
no,
it's so
probably
easy to go there.
Yeah.
But like,
can you
it's really
explain, right?
good skill to have. And it's a really basic thing as well, is that I just want to make sure I understood it right. And I think there was a point where I would do this a lot, and people would be like, are you doing psychology on me? And I'm like, no, I just want to make sure I actually understood you right.
Yes.
Because I can assume something that you said to be one way, but you actually meant it differently. I just want to make sure I actually got it right. And because I think it might also be because like it's important for me to actually understand what you're saying. I don't want, like, even if we talk one language, it doesn't necessarily mean that we talk one language.
Right. Like it's that deeper connection, right? Where I don't want to know you how I want to see you. I want to know you as you are. And that's different.
Yeah. And that's something that I see with a lot of people, is that even when you want to change somebody, and that's something that I have learned about changing people, is that the only way how you can really change somebody is by starting to change yourself, and then they might take example from you. And that's probably like really, really true for parents, and parents can see that a lot. But that's something that I have seen with people in general, especially if you go a bit to an extreme. So let's say in my case with my cold plunges, jump in a frozen river, do a swim there, people are like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. But what helps is that now they're like, well, if you can do that, I might as well give a go to like cold shower, It's nothing compared to that. And that's where I started to see that sometimes doing things to an extreme can make it easier for somebody else who sees you doing those things to start their small thing. That they're like, well, I have been wanting to do cold showers for a really long time, and I see you doing this like crazy stuff. So I might as well just go and do a cold shower. It's nothing. And I say to them, like, it's not nothing. Like, actually, for me, I prefer to do cold plunges over cold showers, because like I just like them more.
Right.
And for me, cold shower actually feels harder. So I say to them, like, when you don't underestimate the power of cold shower, or that you're doing, oh, I'm just like doing cold shower. I'm like, that's not just cold shower. I actually prefer to do that. It feels easier than doing cold shower.
Right.
And even the perspective that when you do, let's say cold plunge, you're now outdoors. So now water temperature compared to air temperature isn't that big. But when you're doing it
In the house.
in a house,
Yeah.
now you're going from a warm room into the cold. So actually that difference feels much bigger, and it feels maybe even harder to do that, at least to start it. So that's where I say people, like, it's not a small thing. The fact that you do it, that's already a big step. And don't think that, oh, this like ice thing, it's like much harder. No, it's not. Like, it's all perspective, really. But I learned from my experience, because last year I was like, oh, I don't really want to leave this place to go back to city because I will stop doing this. And I'm like, cold showers will not be anything, like, anyways. And I remember first day, as soon as I got in the flat, I was like, okay, I'm gonna try this cold shower, like, whatever. And I get in cold shower and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is actually cold. It's not that easy. So that's where I learned that actually, like, it's not that one thing is like better or not, or if you see it as more extreme, it doesn't mean that it's actually more extreme,
That's true.
So that's one thing that and that's, again, like, you learn a lot from experiences. Because before I would be like, yeah, like cold showers, they're nothing, like I can't really do this or that, or like cold plunges, whatever. Now I'm like, give me a cold plunge. I'd rather do that.
That's easier than the cold
Yeah,
shower.
exactly. And of course there's few things to keep in mind when you do them, because it's not like you get out in the warmth, you actually get out in the cold. So that's where you have to deal with that as well. But at the same time, that's something that I tell people, is that just start something. Like, and when we try to change somebody, we can't really change them, because all you communicate to them is that you're not good enough, or you're doing this wrong.
Right.
And people don't like to hear that.
No.
And they will not change.
Some people are open to hearing that if it's right, but it has to be in relationship. It can't be, I haven't shown you that I care about you, I haven't walked with you through some of these things.
Yeah.
The people who were most open to change from are either complete strangers that we hear in a podcast, right?
Yeah.
Or people who know us and see we're struggling and want to offer advice without shoving it in our face, right? We're much more likely to change when we ask someone for help instead of them trying to make their help happen in our lives.
Oh yeah. And even like one thing that I have learned about like helping people is that when I see something that somebody's struggling with, that I have struggled in the past, I would tell them about my experience.
Yes.
So I did this, and actually, the power story, and actually this really helped me. And that's where I'm not saying that they're doing whatever they're doing wrong or this or that. I just tell them, I know where you're coming from. I had the exact same thing. And sometimes I still have it, let's say. But one thing that I have learned that really, really helps me is this. And they might not act on it day one, but they're like,
They're thinking about it.
Yeah, they're thinking about it. And then if you repeat it enough times, or they see you doing that enough times, they're now starting to discover a possibility of doing that. And over time, they start to do it, and they just keep doing it. And that's where they get results. But that's where a lot of times we underestimate the influence we can have on people just by the work we do on ourselves.
It's true. And also we have the sales psychology, right? Like it takes like 5 to 10 points of contact for them to want to act. It's the same in real life, right? You hear something,
that's a good point.
That's not for me. And then you hear it the 5th time and you're like, maybe I should try it. And then you hear it the 10th time and you're like, what can hurt if I just try it, right?
That is so true. And I know that it's true about myself as well, with like certain things that I have done. I think even with cold showers, I started like, I don't know how many years ago, one of my friends said me about Wim Hof, and I'm like, yeah, it sounds cool, but like it's cold. And I just kept like postponing. And then I just started, and I'm like, oh, okay. Because I think he posted online as well. And I'm like, okay, like I can do a cold shower. And then I did cold shower, and I'm like, okay, I can do another one. And you kind of just keep doing it. But it's really interesting how that works, with how these ideas get like, it's like you plant a seed. And then you just grow it. And then it grows, and they're like, oh, and that's something that I see a lot with people that I don't care if they're like my friends or clients, that I plant this seed, and at some point they come to me, you know what, I have this idea. And I'm like, awesome. Even though I have been planting that for a while.
You're like, it's not your idea. No, just kidding.
Yeah. But that's the thing, like they have to get to a point where they feel like it's their idea, because when you feel like it's your idea, you're more likely to act on it.
And that's one of the things that I do with my clients who need confidence is I make them say the thing I say to them out loud. I'm like, you're going to listen to your own brain way more than you're ever going to listen to me. And the people who are willing to feel silly enough to do it, I always see them like shoot off after that.
Yeah.
And the people who are like hesitant and they don't want to do it, they kind of stay stuck. I mean, it's a physiological thing in our brain, right? We have to convince our brain first because our brain is like, change? No, you might die. Because that's what would have happened when you were a hunter-gatherer, right?
Yep.
Might die. Oh, if you don't shear the sheep this way, everyone's gonna die. So let's not change it.
Oh yeah. And change is something that it's hard. It seems hard because it's uncomfortable. It's something that you don't really know. And that's why I usually say, instead of focusing on big leaps or like this huge change that will change your life, which some people can manage that, but it's not really for everybody. By some people, I mean you going to Europe. But like for some people, it might seem impossible to do that. So I tell them, start with something really small, because the key really is to start and be consistent. Because if you start and now you stay consistent, you start to compound it, where it seems like this thing that you do is really, really small, but it's something that I have seen in my experience with some of the habits that I have been building, that when you start, it feels like, this is ridiculous. Why would I do this? You know, like it doesn't make any change. But then you start to do it more and more and more. And now it's like it becomes this big thing that's like part of your life. And you're like, oh, now I get it. It's the compound effect, the way it works.
The compound effect, right? Yeah. I think Darren Hardy, also Atomic Habits by James Clear, right? That's why people love these books, because they're like, just do the one thing. Like my yoga mat is open on my floor and I work out in my pajamas because there's zero resistance. I don't have to think about changing. I just get out of bed, I go to the mat, I work out, and I'm done, and it's over. And I'm able to do that. Like I'm able to replicate it over and over again. And now I love it. I'm like, oh yes, stretch out all the things, do all the exercises, feel strong.
And he also didn't make big resistance towards starting it, because I think that's where a lot of times it's like, oh, I have to now like dress up, just do it. It takes time. Then I have to do it. That takes another time. Then I might get sweaty and shower. It's like a lot. But you're like, okay, I just gotta go do it. And that's another thing that I have seen with people, is that they make this big thing. And when you have this, let's say, oh, I'm gonna do yoga for like 2 hours, you know, when you have this, you now think, okay, now this is like 2 hours. So now you make big resistance just to starting it. That's where a lot of times people don't end up doing it, because you have big resistance just to start it, because you think, okay, if I start it, it's like 2 hours now, I probably won't do it. Like, I don't want to do it. It's not comfortable. But now if you make it like 5 minutes, show up, just doesn't matter what you're wearing, just like show up, do it. How much more likely is it that you will do it? And then when you build up habit, you just do it longer. But that's something that it's such a powerful concept that feels like, oh, it's nothing. Oh, it's more than nothing.
Right. You had to take away everything to make it nothing. There was all those steps of subtraction, right? I did. I went out and I bought all these like really cool exercise clothes that I don't wear, because if I have to get up and put those on, I might not exercise.
Yeah. And you probably bought them also when you felt like, I'm so motivated to go and do this.
Right. When I was first making the habit. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this is actually keeping me from working out on some days. Why don't I just get rid of it? You know, like the law of subtraction. And it worked. And I was like, okay, who cares if I get my pajamas sweaty? I'm going to wash them anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a big thing. And that's something that I see with so many people, but I feel like we could talk forever.
We could, but luckily you're going to come on my show, so we get to hear more about your business.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And
before we go, is there something that you would want to leave the listeners with?
So I have something that's free for any business owners out there who want to get their one big sentence written and believe it, right? There's some mindset work in there.
Yeah.
So if you go to literarysymmetry.com, it's the first thing on the page, pop in your email and you will get my 30-minute masterclass to learn how to create your business story and to embrace the confidence that you should have as the expert you are, so that when you show up anywhere, you'll be able to tell people what you do with confidence fast.
Yeah. And I will leave the link in bio as well, so that people can easily click it. And yeah, well, I hope to have you on sometime as well, because I feel like there's so many things that we can talk about that we didn't even touch on.
That's true. I know we have too much fun together.
Yeah.